Some things on the internet are not meant to be found. They lurk in the shadows, waiting.
The tape was still turning when they found him. No power, no batteries, no explanation. Just the reels, spinning in the dark, and a voice that shouldn't have existed yet, reading tomorrow's obituaries. They found him in a storage unit off Route 9, outside Millfield, Ohio. Unit 14, padlocked from the inside, which the police noted and then, apparently, decided not to think too hard about. Inside, 40 years of a man's life in cardboard boxes, a folding chair, and one reel-to-reel tape deck, still running. The tape still moving. No power cord plugged into anything. You've heard broadcasts that felt off. A voice that lingered a half-second too long between words. A frequency that seemed to find you rather than the other way around. You turned the dial and told yourself it was interference. What you haven't heard is why. What I'm about to share with you is documented, corroborated by at least 3 independent sources, 2 of whom have since asked me not to use their names. The third one can't ask me anything anymore. This is not a story someone made up on the internet at 2 a.m. This is, and I want to be precise here, something that happened. Something recorded. Something that, once you understand the full pattern, becomes very difficult to. Spent 11 years working overnight shifts at a regional AM station in Kingman, Arizona. Board operator mostly. Sometimes engineer when our actual engineer was dealing with his situation, which was the polite word everyone used for what was a very impolite problem. The point is, I know what a broadcast sounds like from the inside. I know the hiss of a dead line, the mechanical rhythm of an automated overnight feed, the way silence on a frequency isn't really silence at all. It has texture. Wait, you learn to read it. I left that job in 2011. I won't get into why. Some of you who were around for the Denton County tape series might be able to guess. For everyone else, just know it wasn't voluntary, and it wasn't unrelated to what I'm going to tell you tonight. The collection started with my uncle. He passed in 2019 and left me, among other things, 14 boxes of reel-to-reel tapes he'd accumulated across a 40-year career in broadcasting. Most of it was mundane. Old station IDs, weather loops, a truly painful amount of polka programming from a Wisconsin PBS affiliate circa in 1982. But buried in the third box, inside a coffee tin with no label, were 6 tapes that were different NO station markings. No dates, just small strips of white electrical tape with handwritten frequency numbers. I should have thrown them away. My therapist, when I still had one, said I should find a healthier hobby. My therapist has never heard tape 7. I'm not sure my therapist would still be a therapist if she had. Here's what you need to understand about the world these tapes come from. The 1980s radio landscape had gaps in it. Real ones. Pirate broadcasters operating on dead frequencies. Number stations transmitting coded content that the government still hasn't fully acknowledged. Ghost signals, recordings, or transmissions appearing on channels that had no licensed source. Nobody talked about it publicly because nobody with institutional authority wanted to explain it, and nobody without institutional authority was believed. I've been researching these gaps for 4 years. I've lost sleep over it. Genuinely, clinically, my doctor has the paperwork. I've lost a relationship over it, which I take more personally. And I've spent more money than I'm comfortable admitting on equipment, archive access, and one very uncomfortable trip to a records office in Columbus that I'll be covering in a later video, assuming that video gets made. I wasn't going to share this particular collection publicly. I'd made peace with keeping it private, keeping it contained. But then the third tape arrived in the mail, unsolicited, no return address, and the postmark was from a zip code in Millfield, Ohio, the same town where they found the engineer. I had no choice. You deserve to know what's on these tapes. And honestly, after tonight, I think you'll understand why I couldn't carry this alone. Let's start at the beginning. 1986, a radio station in rural Ohio that, officially, had been off the air for 3 years. Before we get into it, I need to acknowledge you people, because some of you have been busy. Since the last upload, my inbox has been a specific kind of overwhelming. Some of you sent written accounts, experiences with frequencies that didn't match any licensed broadcast, radios that turned on by themselves, car stereos that picked up voices on roads where there's no signal for 30 miles in any direction. I've read every single one. Several of them are going into a future video that I'm not ready to talk about yet. But trust me, you'll want to be subscribed when that one drops. Some of you sent recordings. Most were explainable. 2 were not. And one of you, you know who you are, and I genuinely hope you're all right, sent a voicemail. 11 seconds long. The first 5 seconds were your voice, leaving a normal message. The last 6 seconds were something else entirely. We've had 3 people listen to it now. We still don't know what language that is. Drop your theories in the comments. I mean that seriously. This community has cracked things I couldn't. But let's start where this all started for me. 1986, a radio station in rural Ohio that, officially, had been off the air for 3 years. Dale Mercer was not the kind of man who frightened easily. I want you to understand that before we go any further, because it matters. He was 53 years old in the autumn of 1986, a 20-year veteran of regional AM broadcasting, the kind of engineer who could diagnose a failing capacitor by the smell of the room. He'd worked thunderstorms, equipment failures, a fire in the transmitter shed in 1979 that took 3 fingers off a colleague's left hand. He was steady, methodical, the kind of man who wrote everything down. That last detail is why we know what we know. The station was WKOL 1040 AM, licensed out of Hocking County, Ohio. It had gone dark in 1983, funding pulled, license suspended, the usual quiet death of a small regional broadcaster that nobody powerful enough cared about saving. By 1986, the building was technically the property of a holding company out of Columbus that had done nothing with it except pay the minimum to keep the structure from being condemned. Dale had been hired. Cash, no contract, no paperwork that anyone has been able to locate, to perform what the logbook calls equipment inventory and decommission assessment. Basically, go in, catalog what's salvageable, and make sure nothing expensive gets left behind. He started on October 14th. He worked alone, overnight, because the rate was better and because, as he wrote in the first logbook entry, daytime means people stopping to. The logbook entries for the first 2 weeks are exactly what you'd expect. Inventory lists, notes on equipment condition, complaints about the fluorescent lights in the main studio flickering in a pattern he found personally offensive. The building smelled, he wrote, like burnt dust and old coffee and something sweet underneath that I haven't identified yet. He was thorough, precise. Reading those early entries, you get a clear picture of a man entirely in his element, comfortable in the particular silence of a dead broadcast space, which is a different kind of silence than most people ever experience. No hum of active equipment, no standby signals, just the building breathing. The first anomaly appears in the entry dated October 29th. He'd been running a continuity check on the main board, standard procedure, making sure the signal chain was properly dead before recommending equipment removal, when the monitoring speakers, which should have been receiving nothing, began producing audio. His words, picked up a clean signal on 1040. Assumed bleed from another source. Checked the chain. No bleed. Signal is originating on 1040. This is not possible. Continuing to monitor. What he heard that first night was mundane. Aggressively, almost insultingly mundane. Partly cloudy skies expected through Thursday, with overnight lows in the upper 30s across most of Hocking County. Corn futures down 2 cents on the Chicago Board of Trade. Soybean prices holding steady at $4.12 per bushel. A weather report. Farm commodity prices. Delivered in the flat, unhurried cadence of a regional radio announcer who has read the same format 1,000 times. Dale noted the content, noted the technical impossibility of the signal's existence, and then, because he was Dale Mercer, checked every possible conventional explanation before allowing himself to be unsettled. Interference from another station bleeding onto 1040. He checked the frequency allocation records. No licensed broadcaster within a viable range was operating on or near 1040 at the time. A recording somehow triggered within the building's own system. He had personally disconnected the playback chain 11 days earlier. He kept listening. He kept writing. By November 1st, the content had shifted slightly. Still mundane. Local news items, agricultural reports, the occasional fragment of easy listening music, slightly degraded as if from a worn tape, but with an odd specificity. Names of local townships. References to road conditions on routes Dale himself had driven that evening. Small details that could have been coincidental. Dale noted them without conclusion, which tells you everything about his discipline and nothing reassuring about the situation. November 2nd is where the logbook changes. Broadcast mentioned Cynthia by name tonight. Referenced her school. Said she'd be home late on Friday due to rehearsal. That's correct. She has play rehearsal Friday. I have not discussed my daughter with anyone associated with this building or this job. I am writing this down because I want a record that I am not misremembering or misinterpreting. The broadcast said her name. Cynthia. Clear as anything I've ever heard on a board in 20 years. Cynthia was Dale's daughter. 16 years old. Attended Hocking Hills Regional High School, 40 minutes from the station. The broadcast knew her name. November 3rd, it mentioned the address of Dale's home in Nelsonville. Read it out in the same flat announcer cadence as the farm prices. 43 Birchwood Lane. Just dropped it into the middle of a local news segment, like it was a traffic update. Dale wrote 4 lines in the logbook that night, which was unusual. His entries had been getting longer as the anomaly continued, but these 4 lines were short. Clipped. The handwriting, which I've seen in photographs of the original document, tightens on this page. Gets smaller, more controlled. The handwriting of a man applying deliberate pressure to his own reaction. It knows where I live. I do not know what it refers to. I am going back tomorrow night. I need to understand the mechanism before I make any decisions about reporting this. There is an explanation. There is always an explanation. There is not always an explanation. November 4th is the last entry. It is 6 lines long, and the final 2 lines are incomplete. The pen appears to have dragged across the page, as if Dale's hand moved away from the logbook suddenly, pulled by something he heard. The legible portion of the entry confirms that the broadcast had, that night, shifted from past and present tense into future tense. It was no longer reporting. It was predicting. What it predicted, specifically, the coroner's report does not detail. That report took 6 weeks to be declassified after Dale's disappearance and subsequent discovery. 6 weeks is a long time for a document describing one man's death in an empty building to require classification at all. Dale's last entry was dated November 4th. According to the coroner's report, which took 6 weeks to be declassified, November 4th was the night the broadcast told him exactly how it would end. Dale Mercer was not alone. That's the part that took me the longest to accept. Not because the evidence wasn't there, but because accepting it meant accepting something about the scale of what we're dealing with. One man, one station, one dead frequency in rural Ohio is a tragedy and a mystery. 7 incidents across 12 years and 4 time zones is a pattern. And patterns have authors. Here's what I've been able to document. Ohio, 1986, you just heard it. Georgia, 1983, a pirate signal on a decommissioned agricultural broadcast frequency, transmitting crop yield predictions for farms that no longer existed. In a voice that 3 separate witnesses described as too patient. Minnesota, 1985, a number station variant that recited names from a local church directory, in order, 1 per night, for 11 consecutive nights. The church had burned down in 1971. New Mexico, 1989, we'll get there. Tennessee, 1991, a frequency that broadcast a single woman's daily routine back to her, in real time, with a 4-minute delay. 7 incidents total. I'm covering 3 tonight. The other 4, I'm not ready. And neither, I think, are you. Researchers who traffic in this territory use the term echo frequencies, signals that behave as though they are reflecting something rather than originating it, the way radar returns an image of what's already there. It sounds technical. It's meant to. The term first circulated in the same quiet corners of the radio community that tracked UVB-76, the Russian signal that has broadcast continuously since 1973 and still has no fully verified explanation. Number stations. The WLW transmitter experiments of the 1930s, powerful enough to induce audible signal in metal fillings. There is a long, documented history of broadcast technology doing things it formally cannot do. 2 theories exist. The first, these are elaborate technical anomalies, atmospheric ducting, equipment malfunction, the electromagnetic equivalent of a ghost image on an old television. Unsettling, but sourceless. Random. The second theory is that they are not random at all, that they are intentional, targeted. That something, and I am being deliberately imprecise with that word, is using these frequencies with a purpose we don't yet understand. I want to be honest with you. I don't know which one is worse. The second story I'm about to tell you was submitted to me by a woman who worked overnight at a Wisconsin NPR affiliate in 1987. She asked me not to use her real name. I'm calling her Carol. Carol, and that's not her real name, but it's the name she asked me to use, and I respect that, was 31 years old in the winter of 1987, working the overnight board shift at a public radio affiliate outside Madison, Wisconsin. She'd been doing it for 4 years. She liked it, she told me, because overnight public radio is about as close to peace as a job can get. Automated classical programming, the occasional pre-recorded talk segment, and 4 to 6 hours of near-total quiet in which to read, think, or simply exist without anyone making demands of her. She was, by her own description, exactly the kind of person you'd want running an overnight board. Calm, methodical, unbothered by solitude. She was unbothered by solitude right up until 3:17 a.m. on February 11th, 1987, at which point the automated broadcast cut mid-phrase. Schubert, she remembers, something quiet and unhurried, and was replaced by a conversation. Not static, not interference. A conversation. 2 voices, both male, both carrying the particular flat effect of people who spend their professional lives on the phone, not bored exactly, but drained of inflection through repetition. They were, As far as Carol could determine in the first few seconds of listening, reading from a list, cross-referencing items, the way you'd imagine a mid-level administrator sounds when reconciling an inventory spreadsheet at the end of a quarter. This is the part where you do the same thing Carol did. She checked the board, checked the input channels, the line feeds, the automation system. Looked for the button she might have accidentally hit, the connection she might have inadvertently opened. We always look for the button first. It's the right instinct. It's the sane instinct. She hadn't hit anything. Every input was where she'd left it. The signal was coming in clean on the main line, overriding the automation feed from a source she could not identify. She kept listening because, as she told me, she didn't. Confirming entries for the 11th. Revised schedule, February block. Voice 1, measured, reading. Confirmed. Running the Wisconsin cluster first. Voice 2, slightly deeper, the sound of someone making a check mark. A list of names followed. Carol described them as read in pairs. A name, then a location, then what she initially took to be a reference number. The pacing was unhurried, professional, the kind of cadence that belongs to conference calls and quarterly reviews, not to broadcast frequencies at 3 a.m. She listened to perhaps a dozen entries before her brain, which had been dutifully cataloging the information as background noise, suddenly sharpened on a single detail. The location referenced in one of the entries was the address of the station she was sitting in. She leaned forward. She waited. She heard her name. Howarth, Carol M. Overnight, facility on record. February 11th. Just that. No elaboration. No context. Her name, her professional designation, her location, and tonight's date, read in the same disinterested tone as everything before it. Filed. Checked. Moved past. Carol told me she sat completely still for what she believes was about 45 seconds. She described the experience not as fear initially, but as a profound wrongness, the sensation of having stepped into a room that has been specifically arranged around your absence. Everything in its place, but none of it for you. She said it felt like being read. Then the rationalization started, because Carol was a practical person and practical people rationalize. A crossed feed from another source. A prank, somehow, by someone who knew her name and her shift. A test by station management that had gone badly designed. She ran through every explanation available to her and found each one wanting. And while she was running through them, the voices on the broadcast continued their list without pause or acknowledgement of her existence beyond that single, flat entry. She called the FCC regional office. This was not a simple decision at 3 a.m. She had to look up the number, which took time, during which the voices continued. She got through to an overnight duty engineer on the third attempt. She explained the situation. Unauthorized signal overriding her licensed broadcast frequency, content unknown in origin, request for identification and source tracing. There was a silence on the line, not the silence of a man consulting a directory or pulling up a screen. The silence of a man who had just heard something he recognized. Then he laughed. Brief. Quiet. The laugh of someone who laughs when they are not amused because the alternative is worse. "Ma'am," he said, "I'd recommend you step away from the board for the remainder of your shift." Carol asked him what that meant. He said, "It means what I said. Step away. Don't record it. Don't document the frequency. Go sit somewhere that isn't the broadcast room and wait for morning." Carol asked him if she was in danger. The line went quiet again. Then, "I'm going to transfer you to a recording. For your own records." A click. Hold music, ironically, classical. And then nothing. The call disconnected. She tried the number again. It rang out. By the time she returned her attention to the board, the signal had stopped. The automation had resumed mid-phrase, Schubert picking back up as though nothing had interrupted it, with the seamless indifference of a machine that doesn't understand what it missed. The clock on the board read 3:31 a.m. 14 minutes had passed since the interruption began. Carol filed an incident report with station management the following morning. The report was acknowledged. No follow-up came. She left the station 6 weeks later, citing personal reasons, and has not worked in broadcasting since. She agreed to speak with me on the condition that I not pursue the identity of the FCC duty engineer from that night. I have pursued it anyway. I haven't found him. The duty logs for that regional office for February 11th, 1987 list the overnight position as unstaffed. The station itself closed in 1991. The official reason was funding restructuring. The fire marshal's report said the blaze started in the tape archive room. Know some of you have already opened a new tab to check if any of this is real. That's okay. Close it. You won't like what you find. And I know another portion of you are currently composing a very confident comment about signal bleed or frequency interference or some other technical explanation that I promise you I have already considered and discarded. I appreciate the impulse. I used to have it too. There's something uniquely 1980s about this kind of horror. No smartphones. No way to pull out a device, hit record, crowdsource an explanation, post it, and have 40,000 strangers validate or debunk it by morning. Just you, a frequency, and whatever decided to use it. The isolation of that, the inability to instantly share the wrongness with anyone, is something we've lost the capacity to fully imagine. I think that's part of why these cases stayed quiet for so long. The first two stories have explanations. Uncomfortable ones. Deeply, structurally uncomfortable ones. But explanations, the shape of one, at least. The next one doesn't. Drop in the comments if you've ever experienced something you couldn't explain on a radio or a scanner or anything that receives signal that I'll check after I finish recording this. Assuming I'm still here. Alright, story 3. I debated not including this one. I'm still debating. In the spring of 1989, a group of 4 amateur radio hobbyists in rural Torrance County, New Mexico held what they called a scan night, a regular Friday gathering where they'd pool equipment, work through the frequency spectrum, and log whatever they found. They were enthusiasts in the purest sense. No agenda, no monetization, just the genuine pleasure of listening to what the air was carrying. The group had been doing this for 6 years. They were methodical, experienced, and deeply familiar with the particular texture of anomalous signals in that part of the state. Military-adjacent frequencies, experimental transmission sites, the occasional pirate broadcaster running music out of a truck bed somewhere in the desert. What they found that night was none of those things. At 9:43 p.m., on a frequency in the lower AM band that their logs confirm had registered as dead on every previous scan, they picked up a broadcast. Clean, professional, full audio quality, better than some licensed stations they monitored regularly. A host, a format, music, the complete architecture of a functioning radio program. The host's voice was the first thing that struck them as wrong, though it took them a while to articulate why. It wasn't distorted. It wasn't degraded. It was, one of the group wrote in their session log, too smooth. Like a voice that had been practiced until all the human parts wore off. The cadence was that of a mid-70s AM personality, warm but controlled, the kind of broadcaster who had been trained to sound like your friend while remaining always, precisely, a performance that he introduced a song. The song was Benny and the Jets by Elton John, released in 1973. The group noted the track in their log without alarm, Oldies programming ran on pirate stations regularly. The host returned after the song and referenced, in passing, the Watergate hearings. He mentioned gas prices. He made a brief, wry comment about a recent Gerald Ford press conference. Gerald Ford left office in January 1977. One of the group, a man I'll call Raymond, who was the most technically experienced of them and who kept the most detailed logs, pulled out a frequency almanac and began cross-referencing. The music, the cultural references, the advertising copy that ran between segments for businesses and products with the specific aesthetic of a particular era. Everything on this broadcast pointed to the same window, 1974. Not approximately, with a specificity that ruled out coincidence. They were receiving a broadcast from 1974, in 1989, on a frequency that should have been carrying nothing. Raymond's log from that night is 12 pages long. I have a photocopy. The first 4 pages are technical notations, signal strength, frequency stability, audio quality measurements, all delivered in the handwriting of a man trying very hard to remain a technician in the presence of something that technically could not exist. The observations are precise and completely, utterly without explanation. The broadcast included call-ins. This is where I need you to pay close attention. The callers were, like the host, crystal clear. They asked questions about local events. They made requests. They chatted. They sounded like real people having a real conversation with a real radio host on a real night in 1974, which, the group slowly came to understand, was exactly what they were. Raymond spent the following 3 weeks researching every caller who gave a name on the broadcast. There were 9 of them. 7 were dead before 1989. Confirmed. Obituaries, death records. 2 of them with detailed documentation because their deaths had been notable in their communities. The 8th couldn't be located at all in any record, which is its own category of disturbing. The 9th caller was alive. Her name, her real name, not the one she gave on the broadcast, which was a nickname, was found through a chain of research. When Raymond's group contacted her, carefully, indirectly, giving no indication of why they were asking, she denied ever calling a radio station. Any radio station. She said she'd never been comfortable on the phone in groups, had always declined that kind of thing, didn't understand what they were referring to. On the recording, Judy's voice is warm, relaxed. She sounds like someone who calls radio stations regularly. She chats with the host for approximately 2 minutes about a community event in her county. Then, as the conversation is winding down, the host asks her if there's anything else she'd like to say to the listeners. There is a pause. 3 seconds, maybe 4. On an AM call-in broadcast, that's a long pause. Then Judy says, just that people should pay attention to what gets left on. You'd be surprised what keeps running after everyone's gone home. The host laughs, thanks her, moves on. The broadcast continues. Raymond's group sat in silence for a long time after that, because Judy's voice, in that moment, had changed. Not dramatically, not into something monstrous. It had simply lost the warmth, become, for those 4 seconds, as smooth and practiced and emptied out as the host's. And what she said could not have been said in 1974 by a woman who, in 1974, had no context for saying it. What she said was, in the most technical sense, ambiguous. I've shared the recording, or a transcription of it, with several people who follow this channel, and the theories in my notes run to 11 pages. I'm not going to tell you what I think it means. I want you to sit with it. I want you to leave your interpretation in the comments, because the range of what people hear in those 2 sentences has itself become one of the most unsettling things about this case. Raymond kept the recording. He transferred it across formats as technology changed, reel to tape to digital, and maintained it until his death in 2003. His equipment and files were donated to a storage facility by his estate, where they sat until a relative began clearing the unit earlier this decade. The tape was mailed to me. No note, no return address. The postmark was from Torrance County, New Mexico. It was dated 1989. I've been sitting here for 20 minutes since I last played it, and I still don't know whether the right thing to do is keep listening or walk across the room and let it run until it's done. It occurs to me that I don't know which of those options would be worse. It occurs to me, sitting here with the tape in my hands and the room very quiet, that this is probably what Raymond felt in Dale and Carol at 3:17 a.m. with Schubert picking back up like nothing had happened. The frequency is still warm. Let me tell you what Dale, Carol, and Raymond's group have in common. Not the obvious things, not the broadcast anomalies, not the personal information, not the institutional silence that followed each incident. The specific things. The things that took me 4 years and 3 separate timelines pinned to a wall in my spare room to identify. First, frequency range. Every confirmed incident clusters in the same narrow band of the AM spectrum, lower midband, the range that in the 1980s was most commonly associated with agricultural and regional community broadcasting. Not the high-traffic frequencies, not the ones with the most oversight. The quiet end, the end where a dead signal draws the least attention. Second, time of occurrence. Every incident happened between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. Every single one. You could argue shift coverage, fewer personnel, less monitoring. That's the charitable reading. The less charitable reading is that whatever is generating these signals knows when the rooms are emptiest. Knows, specifically, when the person most likely to be alone with the broadcast is most alone. Third, and this is the one that took me the longest to accept, the name knowing. Dale's daughter. Carol's professional designation and location. The caller Judy. That knew something it couldn't have known. Every incident involves a broadcast that demonstrates awareness of the specific human in proximity to it. Not general awareness. Personal. Precise. The kind of precision that implies not just reception, but research. These frequencies are not malfunctioning. That's the conclusion I keep arriving at, from every direction I approach it. There's an institutional angle here that I've been careful with, because I'm not interested in attaching this to a framework that lets people dismiss it. But I'd be dishonest if I didn't acknowledge what exists in the documented record. MKUltra's lesser-known communication experiments, which ran well into the 1970s and touched broadcast infrastructure in ways the declassified files only partially describe. The Global Numbers Station Network, still active, still officially unacknowledged by most governments, which has always required a transmitter, a schedule, and a listener. UVB 76, broadcasting since 1973, its purpose still unverified. There is precedent for signals that carry intent and resist explanation. The question has always been whose intent. Here is the reframe that I can't stop thinking about. What if these broadcasts aren't reaching out to the people who hear them? What if Dale and Carol and Raymond's group were never the intended recipients? What if they were just close enough to a signal aimed at something else, something that doesn't need a radio to receive it, that the human readable content bled through as a side effect? What if the names and addresses and futures aren't threats? What if they're just data? What if we're the interference? I don't know what that implies about what's on the other end of the frequency. I've thought about it long enough that I've stopped being able to think about it directly. I have to approach it sideways, the way you look at something very bright. What I can tell you is, That every person who got close to these signals, who sat alone in a room and listened long enough to understand what they were hearing, made the same decision afterward: silence. Dale couldn't make that decision. Carol made it, and it cost her. Raymond kept the tape for 14 years and never published a word. I'm telling you because I decided, at some point in the last year, that silence is its own kind of transmission. And I've been quiet long enough. There are 4 more cases I haven't told you about. I'm not ready, but I will want to be straight with you right now. In whatever way I'm capable of being straight about any of this. I have more materials, more tapes, more case files, more documents from more people who reached out through channels I didn't expect and asked me, in varying degrees of urgency, to keep what they sent me safe. I haven't processed all of it, not logistically, and honestly, not emotionally either. Some of it I've opened once and put down. Some of it I haven't opened at all. You're the only reason I keep doing this. And I mean that in a way that goes beyond the standard thing people say at the end of videos. I mean that the act of bringing this to you, of making it shared rather than solitary, is the only framework I've found that makes it bearable. You're my co-investigators. You've cracked details I missed, connected cases I hadn't linked, sent submissions that changed the direction of entire threads of research. The comment section on the last video had a theory about the frequency clustering that was more technically precise than anything I'd put together myself. You know who you are. So, leave your theories on Judy, on the FCC engineer Carol spoke to, on what Raymond's group was actually receiving that night in Torrance County. Subscribe if you want to be here when Part 2 goes up, and Part 2 will go up, assuming the timeline holds. Now, there's one more thing I need to tell you before we close. Among the tapes in the collectee,